So I think, being able to follow patients long-term without adding a huge cost to it is invaluable especially for any company, but especially maybe a small company with limited resources.
You're listening to Data Nerds in the OR, a surgeon's journey toward value-based care. The podcast focused on data and data science as the keys to a better healthcare system. Ideas brought to life by the vision and experience of host Dr. Bruce Ramshaw. Each week, Dr. Ramshaw sits down with different players in the healthcare system to discuss how data is used today and what it could do if it were used effectively, how it could improve surgical quality, education, outcomes, and drive better patient care. Let's dive into the latest episode. Here's your host, Dr. Bruce Ramshaw.
Well, thank you very much for attending our podcast, Data Nerds in the OR. On this episode, we have CEO of Novus Scientific, Henrik Hjorth, a friend of mine. We've worked together for almost, 15 years or so, in and out of projects and work primarily with the technology that Henrik helped develop. And I'll let him introduce himself a little more thoroughly. But Henrik, thank you very much for your time and for participating on our podcast today.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me. And it's an honor to be asked to be on board this podcast. I've been looking forward to it. And you're right. I was just counting the years backwards, and I think we met the first time maybe in 2006 or 7 even. My name, as I said, is Henrik Hjorth. I'm CEO of a Swedish company called Novus Scientific. I've been on and off, but mostly on with the company and the technology that we're working with for the better part of the last 20 years. We started in 2004. Part of another company called Radi Medical Systems. That was another Swedish startup in interventional cardiology and radiology. Part of that company, and I was an engineer just fresh out of university at the time. We had the brilliant idea of developing the world's first long-term absorbable surgical mesh for soft tissue repair and reinforcement. And that's what we did. We spun off the project into a new company when Radi got sold in 2009. And that was Novus Scientific that we formed. So I've had multiple hats and different roles within this small organization. And I took a little break and worked for another Swedish implant startup called Ostdesign for a couple of years in the neurosurgery around the patient-specific implant for cranial reconstruction. Also fascinating technology, biomaterial-based innovative implants. But a couple of years ago, I came back to Novus Scientific and took on the job as CEO. So 20 years with surgical meshes and absorbable polymers.
Yeah, congratulations on that career and the becoming CEO. We'll talk a little bit about that, the pros and cons of being in that kind of role. Yeah. The first thing I want to hear from you from the perspective of, you build a technology, you build a company, and you want to see, the impact on patients. I mean, I think that's why we all go into healthcare is we want to see our hard work have a positive impact on patients and patient outcomes. So maybe talk about the value of data. You bring something to market and do the pre-market studies. But as we all know, we really don't know what's going to happen until we get it out in the real world in healthcare and surgeons use your product, patients get implanted with your product. What's your view on the value of data for supporting a product like Tiger Matrix?
Data it's obviously invaluable in what we do. And now there's going to be maybe cases or examples of products or technologies that have made their way fast up get a fast adoption based on other things like aggressive marketing or some kind of hype. But longer term, if you want to be in this business, you better make sure that you provide patient value of some kind. And whether that is directly to the outcome or whether it is in the system that you're improving a process or you're taking down the cost or you're making something more efficient, that's fine too. But before you've actually figure out a way to measure what you're doing and be able to correlate that to how things were being done before, then you're really not selling anything except, the intuitive idea of things being better. And I think maybe from our stories that maybe we were a bit just comparing our technology, which is based on materials that go away over time, to what the gold standard was in 2010 when we first launched Tiger Matrix. It was permanent materials, and with the background we had, it's like, well, obviously this has to be better because it goes away, right? And you're reducing risk, and yeah, I think we ended up being right. But before you can substantiate that, you don't really have much. So yeah, at the end of the day, yeah, it's all about data and being able to present data and make data accessible to people. Question is just what kind of data are you going to talk about then? So Tiger Matrix, as you said, it was the world's first long-term absorbable surgical mesh, but it's just not something that goes away over time. It's designed so we're using two different absorbable materials, and they have different times when they degrade and lose their strength contribution to the product. And this allows us, and this is the thing, allows us to produce a device that has one set of mechanical characteristics when you take it out of the box and implant it. And then over time, it by design then changes its mechanical characteristics along with a anticipated kind of healing trajectory of the patient. So in our case, it starts out very firm and kind of like this, like Bruce would like to
tear it apart, right?
Bruce would try, but he won't be able to. But then over time, it becomes more flexible and more compliant. And the whole idea is to then the load that is being absorbed by the mesh early on should be transferred back to the new tissue that grows into the mesh in the patient. This then stimulates collagen or connective tissue remodeling. So the idea is to use different materials to have implants that have different characteristics over the time.
Yeah, and that's what we try to help do together is identify how do we measure things better, both for, the outcomes we want to see together in the patient, but also for supporting the technology that your company brings to the patient. I was impressed as we met, like you said, I think I was at Missouri in the chief of general surgery role, and we had a materials characterization lab with a biologic engineer, Sheila Grant. And so it was really interesting because I do remember some of those early discussions when you come to a hernia surgeon who my whole career as an expert hernia surgeon, I've used mesh and permanent mesh. And the concept was a hernia is a hole and you got to patch the hole with the mesh. And, the first thought was, why would we want the mesh to go away? But then, when your company and the colleagues you had, really did a fantastic job with the pre-market studies you did, the data you generated. I think there was a 3-year sheep study, and then there was an inguinal hernia study in the EU. Maybe talk about the things you learned as you got some data from both animal studies and then the human study before you launched in the US. And I'll talk more about how my mindset evolved around the use of resorbable synthetics rather than permanent synthetic.
Yeah, and it really starts the onset of starting a development project when you're getting in, because for us, this was really new. We were in interventional cardiologists, where data plays a pretty big role, and it's pretty structured and mature already. But surgery being very multifactorial is a bit different. And it goes down all the way to what kind of requirements does a new product need to have, and what do you need to live up to, and where do you find that data? So when we started, we had to assess a bunch of competition don't want to share their data, and that's understandable. So we had to test our way through and then determine what's important and what's not, and what's really going to make a difference. And I'm not sure we got it right the first time. But at the end of the day, you can collect all these technical parameters, and you can measure things. And and this is fun because general surgery community leads are still kind of debating over which characteristics of a surgical mesh that should be tested and how they should be tested. Even though there are standards for testing, it's not everyone's testing. You're talking about apples and oranges all the time. So, but that being said, you can have a product that is strong and it's big or it's thick or thin or it kind of fulfills all these requirements. But does it really matter to the patient? So ultimately, you have to have that progression. We did small animal studies before we evolved into, we figured that we need a model that has a relevant anatomy from a mechanical point of view, hernia repair, and it's very much a mechanical discussion for many users. So that's why we selected a shape model, and we realized also that we're always going to get asked what happens. So what happens when the mesh goes away then? We needed to have an answer to that question, and that's why we ran a long-term preclinical study over 3 years, which we also published before we then entered into a first-in-man trial in Sweden, which was also part of the underlying documentation to receive a CE mark. When you start a project like that, then it's the first thing and it's new and you're kind of challenging the idea that this needs to be in the patient for the rest of their lives. Yeah, it helps if you're a little bit naive when you start, because there's a lot of stuff you need to go through before you're even close to seeing it in patient. But no, first patient was very rewarding and very exciting moment. And there's been lots of data collected along the way.
Going back to when I first heard about the concept, for a few years, I was a little unsure. In the first in human, the inguinal data, some of the direct hernias did have recurrences.
Yep.
As we began to learn about the mesh complications, and as you know, we studied mesh after it came out of people. That was almost 20 years ago. It really began to change my thinking because I thought that mesh was inert. Permanent synthetic mesh was inert. And Sheila Grant, our biologic engineer who educated me that no, when you put something in the body, it's going to undergo biologic interactions.
Things happen.
The interesting thing we found was the same mesh placed the same way in different people could have very different interactions and undergo very different amounts of biologic interactions. And that was really mind blowing for me because I was always teaching that it's all about technique. And, if you put the mesh in with good technique, you're going to have good outcomes. And that's not true, unfortunately, in some patients. So I think about that time, a lot of the interest was in biologic mesh, which came to the market very expensive. And we were beginning to see the mesh complications like chronic pain, erosion, contraction. And so we began to look at alternatives. And when we started talking about a long-term resorbable synthetic, from my perspective, the biologics, not only are they very expensive, but they're also complex materials. They come out of animals or humans. A synthetic resorbable is a lot more consistent in terms, and that's what we saw when we began to do our clinical quality improvement project with you in abdominal wall reconstruction. We began to see, the mesh had a fairly predictable performance in a human being. And as you know, we followed patients for quite a while and saw the big concern was, after 3 years and the mesh is gone, what's going to happen? And we had nearly 100 patients and 4.5 year follow-up, and we didn't have recurrences after the first couple of years. So it was rewarding, I'm sure, for you as well as me as the surgeon to see that kind of outcome. Maybe talk a little bit about the value, once you get on the market and we start using it in a quality improvement project and you start to see the outcomes, maybe talk about the value of that kind of method that we developed to work with industry and really focus together on partnership in measuring our outcomes and learning together. How was that process for you?
Yeah, no, it's certainly, and yeah, it's a super interesting kind of area here because especially I've been around surgery, plastic surgery, neurosurgery, general surgery the whole time. But surgery is there are so many factors affecting outcomes. And as an industry, ultimately you want to talk about patient outcome one way or the other, right? But you really, as I said, you were able to have spectacular results. But it wasn't only the mesh. That's one part of it. It's everything from patient selection, procedure selection, technique, and all these things that goes into ultimately measuring patient outcome in one way or another. And I think that's where if you're a small startup like we were, if the alternative is to say, hey, we're going to do this large, we're going to now bet on this large randomized clinical trial where we're going to measure A versus B. And then you set that up and you recruit the whole thing around it, and it's going to cost you a fortune. Mm-hmm. And it comes out and it's like, oh, we should have looked at this over here instead, or we didn't see that. And it's possible to back up and redo things. By doing it the way you did, and we did, it's like, well, we do this under a set of parameters, and then we change parameters, and then we see what kind of outcome change that we get, right? But we're doing it in a controlled fashion, and it reflects real world evidence. And I think, I don't know, you're the expert, obviously, but it kind of makes sense if you're not taking a pill and measuring an effect of that pill, but if you're just changing one piece of this complex puzzle. Again, for us, it was invaluable because we were then able to remove an important contraindication based on that type of data. And there's publications coming out of it and all the sort of the traditional talking points that you need as a company to get adoption and get users and success. So yeah, I know there is a shift. There was trials, randomized trials, into registers, and hopefully also into kind of real world evidence data collection. I don't know, I'm not a super huge fan of the new medical device regulations in Europe, but they are focusing more on post-market surveillance and follow-up of real world evidence and feeding that back into the regulatory bodies instead of kind of having everything approved before launching. Well, still got to have evidence before you launch, but they put more emphasis on the whole post-market surveillance thing and real world evidence. But I think it's slowly moving in the right direction. I don't know if I guess you have the same idea.
Yeah, it's refreshing because, as you know, I've been working on this with a small group for almost 20 years, and it, the timing is finally getting better. And I think the awareness, and it's really a mindset thing, right? Not thinking we know the one answer, but learning together how to improve outcomes through data analysis, brainstorming. Unfortunately, people think that, the doctor knows all the right answers, and we really don't. We're kind of flying blind without a good data and analytics infrastructure, but that's what this CQI method will do for us. And we experienced it together, and it was lots of different perspectives, from the patient perspective to your perspective and your knowledge of the product and my expertise as a hernia surgeon. But to bring all that together around the patient and to see the impact on improving outcomes. And the hospital was very happy because, as you remember from the project, we actually saved a lot of money for the hospital, and the hospital benefited financially as well. So there was a kind of win-win-win for everybody. Maybe just briefly, because part of that project and part of the FDA work to remove the contraindication was the value of long-term follow-up. And I know Remy Foreman, who now at Care Syntax, she directs the patient effort. Maybe talk about the value that part of the project was for Novus Scientific and for the effort we had with the FDA.
from kind of the type of technology we have, and also in the context of what was happening around meshes at the time, in surgery, I think being able to show long-term positive outcomes builds trust and builds comfort with everyone. And I can, especially I can tell you as an inventor, and as a responsible for the company, it's being able to know that there is not any kind of, you got your everything is covered. If you have a long-term success rate, you know what to expect. Especially when you have a product that goes way over time, it's super important. So I think, being able to follow patients long-term without adding a huge cost to it, is invaluable for especially, for any company, but especially maybe a small company, with limited resources. And again, going back to surgery being so multifactorial that it's you think you're looking at A versus B, right? But what you should really focusing on is what's happened with C over time.
Yeah.
Like someone once said that there's to any complex problems, there's always a simple solution, and it's wrong. A little bit of that.
Yeah, it's it was the complexity of the patients, these patients with, complex abdominal wall hernias and recurrences. That was a tough group. And through our project together over a period of years, we were able to see a lot of factors that we didn't think of at first. The one that stands out and that I use a lot is the emotional state of the patient, the neurocognitive state of the patient. When you've had a patient who's had 10, 20 hernia repairs and their, intestines and skin is stretched down to their knee, it's very disfiguring. That's a trauma to a human being that is very, very challenging to understand and deal with. But, as we were able to use data science principles, we were able to define the neurocognitive state and then begin to do prehabilitation and implement preoperative things like cognitive behavioral therapy to help them resolve and deal with the trauma that they experience often from prior surgery and the results of prior surgery. So, being able to understand how to use data science tools to reveal those factors that we can then modify and do something about, and then see the impact on outcomes, that was very rewarding.
It goes back also to like how you define patient outcome. What's a successful patient outcome, and when in time should you be measuring that? Is that just you left the hospital, or how was your life looking 1 year after? And now Tiger Matrix is being used predominantly in breast reconstructive surgery, cancer patients, which is also it's a patient group that has normally been going through a lot, and it's reconstruction, and then there's expectations on aesthetic outcome as well, and you deal with these complex scenarios, and then a question comes alive again. So when do we consider this being successful, and what should we be looking at in order to be able to talk about it later, and when in time?
Yeah, and I think that's an open-ended question that we can always do better with when we, learn how to work together with multiple perspectives and listen to the patient perspective. Kind of reminds me of I use the Moneyball example in Major League Baseball, when data scientists finally got Major League Baseball to listen. Before that, everyone used the same exact measurements, the box score, hits, runs, RBIs. And, nobody was innovating around how to measure things better. But once they started to learn the principles of data science, they were able to use much better measurements. And it led to, at least short-term, a competitive advantage for the teams that did that first. Now there's no competitive advantage because they're all doing it. But in healthcare and surgery, we have the opportunity to figure out how to measure things better. And, one example that I use comes from our abdominal wall reconstruction CQI project where we were measuring, and this is really important to our project. We were measuring wound infection and wound complications the way that everybody does because the CDC mandates reporting of wound infections based on the measurement of superficial, deep, and organ space. And I think Remy talked to some patients who had wound infections and asked, what do you think of this measurement? And they were like, that doesn't really matter to us. And basically said, well, how should we be measuring wound infections? And they basically said, well, how invasive is the treatment required to heal our wound? And how long did it take to heal our wound? And when we measured it that way, it was a much better reflection of value than the CDC definition. So the point is, in data science principles, we can always improve how we measure things if we put our minds to it, use different perspectives. So,
but maybe, I was just saying that maybe in industry, we're a little bit more, in a way, used to having a continuous process because we have to do continuous improvement, right? That is the essence of the regulatory systems and especially, ISO 13485. You need to have a quality management system that is undergoing constant scrutiny, and you need to check and make sure your processes are adequate, and then they should improve them all the time. So you can't fix this thing with just doing like one study. It needs to be an ongoing process towards evolving into something better. But again, healthcare is it's not a small beast with everything.
yeah.
So
Well, and you bring up a good point. When we were learning this, and we were looking for how do we get healthcare to embrace the mindset of continuous improvement, we thought the natural partnership would be working with industry because of exactly what you said. I knew as a surgeon, I was not really taught well how to measure outcomes of the whole patient process and use data science tools to improve those outcomes. And I know hospitals were not taught that, payers were not taught that, but it was really industry was the only stakeholder in healthcare who really had that mindset of continuous improvement around their products. So that was part of our thinking when we started our business around partnering with industry rather than going to payers or going to hospitals at first. But I think more and more of the stakeholders in healthcare are starting to embrace this. So hopefully the timing's good to get this more scale. Because like you said, healthcare is not a small thing. It's a major global problem.
but also now you have this, or you're starting, and I don't, and I'm sure Care Syntax, if any, has the best grip on what you can do with data today versus what you could do 10, 15, 20 years ago. And now it's a whole different, the possibilities are, I guess, very different now than they used to be in terms of measuring, in terms of storing, analyzing, AI, what have you. It's exciting to see where we could end up.
Yeah, that's part of the timing, right? The technologies are there. We're using, LLM and Gen AI technologies to be able to acquire and clean data that we couldn't do, a few years ago. So that's, hopefully it's all coming together. Maybe that's another question. Do you see differences in the use of data or the ability to use data in the EU versus the US? Are there differences in the privacy laws? Anything that you've noticed in your role?
Yeah, that's a good question. Europe, it's not one entity, right? From that point of view. And I guess it's more about maybe cultural differences between surgeons in different regions of Europe or different regions of the world. Normally, maybe my impression is maybe that in the US, culturally, you're a little bit more adaptive when it comes, or you embrace new methods, change a little bit faster maybe. But that might go back to also there is a competitive system built into also to how the surgeons operate that might be part of driving that too, that you want to be at the forefront of adopting new things and new technology. Whereas Europe, which also differs a lot internally, has different views on these things. So I'm a little bit maybe concerned with Europe as a device market as a whole. with the MDR now being in place, making it really, really expensive and complex for companies to maintain and renew their CE marks, even for products and devices that have a flawless track record. I think there will be important devices that are going to have to be taken off the market, unfortunately.
It's unintended consequences. Yeah, I think, I'm much familiar with the FDA, and we had David Earl on the podcast.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, I know the people have good intentions. They don't want to, they want to do, regulatory well that helps patients, but I think and we've seen it in the US, the unintended consequences are when you put too much regulation, you stifle innovation. And like you said, we're at the point where we may see good products being removed from the market because of the onerous regulatory requirements. And, I hope that they'll be adaptive. I think the US FDA has tried to be adaptive. And I think we're just at the beginning of, moving to real world evidence in a way that can be done very, very safely and very efficiently and much less costly. And so I think that's part of our future. I hope Care Syntax with our methods will help to show how we can do that, and make the patient value be the primary focus. And in doing that, we can minimize some of those burdens.
And I think the system that comes up with the best method to collect and utilize data, also from a regulatory and a risk point of view, we need to be part of that and collecting data along with surgeons and hospitals. But I think the system that implements that in the smartest way first have a lot to gain in terms of weeding out what's good and what's less good. But it's on the system side, and then it's also, you need kind of a system, a regulatory system that is adaptive too. And I mean, the European being what it is with the third-party audit system, it's a little bit slow in making changes. I don't know if the FDA, being one administrative body at least, might be a little bit faster, or if maybe it's another device market that is going to come up and say, hey, look, over here we can make this happen. But it needs to be a joint, kind of everyone needs to be working along the same ideas eventually. And it doesn't seem to be any other way than just looking at what is best outcome.
Well, I think one of the values of our method is bringing your team, the device team, to the surgeon and the clinical team and working together. Maybe talk a little bit about the value of having that kind of relationship in our method of bringing the different perspectives together around the patient outcomes. The value of having access to the clinical team as we learn together.
I mean, invaluable, obviously. And I wish we met earlier, but it needs to be back and forth already from the idea stage. And we were lucky to partner up early with some super innovative, very experienced surgeons who came more from the spine side, but had lots of solid experience of biomaterials and how they work in the body. And then you're able to quickly kind of narrow down your specifications, but just blindly developing something and then go to a hospital. I used to remember when we had a mesh that the first version, you could just tear it apart. You couldn't put a stitch in it. And I went to a hospital in Sweden and showed this and said, Henrik, what do you expect me to do with this?
Yeah.
So, there's these things. I probably should have realized that, but being able to get that other perspective, because it's all different, and being in the hospital all day or dealing with patients all day, and we're this is the Data Nerds podcast, and we're kind of mesh nerds, and then you think when you're a mesh nerd, you think, well, people probably care a lot about meshes, right? There are soft tissue support. And then we speak to a surgeon who's a user of meshes. Even though it's like, it's such a small piece of the daily concern is which mesh to use, that we don't have that perspective because So being able to partner up around the project as a whole and not just designing a trial is invaluable. And I really mean, I wish there would be more. Large companies have different opportunities, possibilities in terms of having clinicians and hospital healthcare practitioners on board early. But if you're a small company, you're relying on people who want to innovate.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit. We had a lot of discussion about your perspective on the value of data applied to your products, but I know you personally have gone through some changes in your career, similar a little bit to me, where I went from a clinician, I was a researcher, but then entrepreneur, and eventually took on the role of CEO of a data science company, a healthcare data analytics company. And that was a big change for me. I'd like to hear your perspective going from an engineer to now CEO of Novus Scientific. What kinds of personal changes did you experience going through those different roles?
I mean, I love innovation, and I think the early part of a project, at the start of a clinical medical device project, is super exciting. As is the phase when you get to launch and you get to kind of see it being used. Between those, there's a lot of other things that need to be done. And I was extremely fortunate to be at a company of the perfect size. Radio Medical Systems was 150 people maybe. And it was small enough so that even if you were young, and I mean, kudos to the upper management and owners who had this culturally implemented, that give responsibilities to relatively young and fresh employees if they wanted to take it on. But I was able to see all the steps hands-on in the journey from idea and IP generation and writing patents all the way up to starting to sell a product. So when you've done that once, you've been through all those hoops, but it's invaluable because then you are pretty comfortable that you understand the challenges day to day of everyone who works in those boxes in a larger organization, maybe, or anywhere. Like I know, because and that gives you the ability to communicate in a relevant way with everyone, because you can a little bit adopt their perspective. Because I've also been in and out of quality assurance, quality control, IP, sales, clinical education. You take a little bite at all those things. And I think what it did to me was that it gave me a respect for everyone else's daily challenges and priorities, and which then, when the time comes and someone asks, would you want to take over the whole bag here, the whole organization? It's like, well, yeah, because I think I benefited from being able to just have that perspective and being able to communicate with everyone, and not just kind of, sometimes CEOs in our business is taking kind of from one end of the organization more than from the other. And that kind of skews the whole thing a little bit, maybe. But yeah, no, I just, it's invaluable to been able to see all those, even if it was for a limited period of time, but you still, you see what people are doing, you understand it. You don't necessarily understand all of it, actually, but at least you can have a relevant conversation. It gives you, because communication is everything when you're a leader, right?
I was just going to say, I think you just described what a good leader does and is, and it is understanding all those different perspectives. For me, it was a little bit of a shift from having been an academic surgeon where I was used to teaching people and telling people about mesh or hernias or whatever. And being a CEO, it's very humbling. You have to really listen and ask questions and understand, especially if you haven't been through all of the different aspects of the company like you have. But I think that was really a description of what a good leader is and does and how they interact with the team.
Yeah, but then I mean, I will obviously get different data to work with as a CEO. That's I think it's also super important to know what you're doing and what kind of priorities you have. And I mean, especially from a small company point of view, maybe certain data points are more important than other when it comes to how you prioritize. No, it's been a fun journey. I had no idea I was going to get stuck in medical devices for 20 years, but I think that's the kind of the blend of healthcare, hospitals, patients, which is really like very, very real. And then you have labs and everything on the other end, and yeah, it's a multifaceted industry, especially I think in small companies where you can kind of spread out early on and do all kinds of things.
So, yeah. And again, back to healthcare, we know we all go into healthcare because we want to see impact on improving outcomes. And I think we're all aware that healthcare has some major global issues in terms of costs and outcomes and sustainability. And we're all struggling to figure out how can we help this system transform to a sustainable system where costs are going down and outcomes are getting better and better. Have you seen any movies, books, anything that kind of has been motivational to you to encourage this healthcare transformation? Anything that comes to mind?
The thing I would like to kind of push a little bit for is the fellow Swede is fortunately no longer with us, but Hans Rosling, who is the founder of Gapminder, and gapminder.org is the website. He also wrote a book called Factfulness, which I recommend everyone to take a look at, which really highlights the importance of having the real facts when you make decisions. I've heard him live at a surgery meeting here in Uppsala, by the way, where he challenges the perception of what you think when it comes to these questions. What is the average life length differences in the world? And where is educational? What about women's health? And you think you have an idea of how things are. That would be the one thing that I would kind of, because it also, he was doctor and it touches on healthcare or public health in many ways. So yeah, super interesting, really motivating, and very relevant these days from all kinds of aspects.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I know of Hans Rosling through the TED Talks that he's given. Extremely entertaining. So anybody search Hans Rosling and TED Talks and you'll see some pretty amazing data demonstrations. I agree. Henrik, thank you so much for your time. Anya, any questions that come up based on our discussion so far?
Perfect. When you talked about the idea that previously, meshes were not resorbable, they were static, permanent tissue repair devices. What was the idea that took you guys from the current state into the resorbable mesh? Because I think that's a really interesting story.
So we had accumulated this kind of top level competence, not myself, but a guy called Torbjörn Mattison, who's the world leading expert on biomaterials and especially they're applied into medical devices. And we wanted to actually look for other areas where we thought absorbable materials could replace permanent materials. And we came across surgical meshes for soft tissue reinforcement based upon, I think, at the time, there started to be these case reports of the complications that you can experience if you have a chronic inflammatory response and a chronic foreign body reaction to a mesh that is then implanted into certain parts of the body. And it looked like an area that needed improvement. And so it turns out later, I mean, in inguinal hernia repair and many of the You can probably second this, Bruce. Many of the kind of normal hernia repairs, permanent materials do very well. There's a very cost-efficient, good way to address that problem. But we've also seen that in other areas, permanent meshes do horribly, and the risk-benefit ratio is not as good. So again, it's not just the material; it's also where you use it and how.
Yeah, like I said, when I was first presented with resorbable synthetic concept, it was like, well, why would we want it to go away? But then, as you mentioned, and as we learned through the data, that there's different subpopulations of people, and I learned that even in a subpopulation of patients, maybe no mesh is the right answer. A tissue repair is going to have the best value. In another subpopulation, a resorbable synthetic will have the best value. And another permanent synthetic will have the best value. We really want to be able to apply our data science tools at CareSyntax to define those subpopulations and match them with the best value treatment. And that's how we're going to have a sustainable healthcare system, I think.
I agree.
Anything else, Anya?
Well, maybe one more, Bruce. We face CQI a lot, and if we have to assume that some people will be tuning in for the first time, we probably need to define that term a little bit for the audience as well.
It's almost like ingrained in my language to say CQI because we've done it for so long, but clinical quality improvement or continuous quality improvement is what CQI stands for. When we talk about our CareSyntax offerings, we look at working with Medtech and provide clinical data as a service. So that's the method behind our clinical data as a service is a continuous quality improvement method. Really, it's continuous value improvement, but everybody's familiar with CQI because of the quality. And the other perspective is for providers, it's really trying to assess the value of any product within their actual patient care. So clinical value analysis is also a concept that we're discussing with our provider partners and clients. But yeah, it's all founded on the mindset of like measurement and improvement. If we can measure something and we can use data tools appropriately, we can improve what we're measuring. And that's really what we need in healthcare if we're going to have a sustainable system, which I think we all want. Well, thank you, Henrik. And thank you, Anya.
Thanks, Bruce.
Enjoyed the conversation. And Henrik, we'll be back in touch real soon because we have some data.
Yeah, because we're doing it again, right?
We're doing it again. We've got 3 plastic surgeons have data. So we will
it'll be super important. Yeah, that's going to be good, I think.
Well, thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Data Nerds in the OR, a surgeon's journey toward value-based care. You'll find links in the show notes to any resources mentioned in today's show. If you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you want more content like this, you can always sign up for our Smart Surgery blog via the link in the show notes. Or if you want to ask Dr. Ramshaw or the team a question directly, please send an email to podcast@caresyntax.com. This episode is brought to you by CareSyntax, the leading vendor-neutral surgical intelligence platform. The CareSyntax platform can ingest and analyze data throughout the surgical workflow, including clinical, operational, financial, and outcomes data to capture a complete picture of the surgical pathway. That data can produce actionable insights to enhance efficiency and innovation for surgical teams, hospital administrators, and medtech developers, driving innovation for the future of healthcare delivery. CareSyntax impacts over 3,000 ORs and more than 3 million annual procedures across the globe. Learn more at www.caresyntax.com.